My name is Michael Guyett, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Izabella Kaminska, founder, editor of The Blind Spot, who's been in the journalism side of things for quite some time. Izabella, for those who are not familiar with you, introduce yourself. Who are you? What have you done throughout your career? And what do you do now?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on. So what have I done in my career? Quite a lot of journalism. I was at the FT for 13 years. I was editor of FT Alphaville, which some of you may know. Before that, I worked at CNBC, Reuters, Platts. I did some time at BP as well. And I started off on English language newspapers in the former sort of Soviet Union and in Poland. So that's my rough history. And now I am founder editor of The Blind Spot, but I've also taken on a new hybrid role in that I'm also working for Politico, heading up their finance growth and development. Well, that's what I'm doing now in a weird new hybrid role, which I think is quite unique for the market.
How has journalism changed over the last 2 decades or so? Aside from just sort of the obvious aspects of information access, internet, so what's changed? What's evolved? What's gotten better? What's gotten worse?
So, I've been at this for 20 years or more. And when I got into it, I think, I was very purist about it all. I wanted to change the world, but in a sort of truth-seeking, Woodward and Bernstein way. I think that was, sort of incredibly naive and foolish, I want to change the world type mindset. And, I think journalism has always been a sort of vocational industry. People don't go into it for the money necessarily. And, I think the main difference is when I was learning journalism, it was all about balance, holding people to account, but also telling really interesting stories. And that meant interviewing everybody. So you could get I don't think there was any stigma associated with interviewing bad guys. People would have been equally interested to interview Saddam Hussein as anyone else. I mean, the impetus was to get behind the story, understand what was going on, and hold those people to account. It wasn't as focused, I guess, as it is now on whether someone has a right to speak on a platform or not. That has been a really big change in my lifetime. And I guess, people like to say that journalists are more campaigning these days. I tend to disagree because I think there's been a campaigning element to journalism for, since the year dot. Journalists have always been on one side or the other. What I think has changed, however, is that the market for neutral news has been slightly corrupted by the campaigning news. And so it's hard to find proper neutral voices or voices that are prepared to look at all perspectives. And I guess for investors, I think this is a really big thing because investors, if you're going to invest wisely, you can't necessarily block out the voices and positions or perspectives that you don't like. You need to account for the entire market because everybody operates in the economy. So even the people, even the opposition buys toothpaste, right? So there will always be an effect of the full spectrum of society in your economic model. And I don't think investors are doing themselves any favors if they refuse to look at the whole picture. And that's where blind spots occur. And the purpose of the blind spot is to look at the full spectrum of stuff that's going on and disassociate yourself from the kind of passion. Like you can analyze these things without, you're not necessarily endorsing things, but you can't ignore them. And that's really the mantra that I'm trying to put forward with the blind spot.
Yeah, and I think the challenge, you'd probably agree with me, is that objectivity gets lost when you have to focus on ratings, which means you have to then, at least that's thinking, factor in entertainment and passion, right, to get people to tune in. I'm curious, was there some kind of major catalyst or event or year where news journalism shifted more towards that sort of personality driven as opposed to neutral driven type of way of expressing a story?
I think that's been happening over time. I mean, there have been subtle changes all along. It's all to do with the nature of media. I mean, Marshall McLuhan's famous observation, the medium is the message. I think we have slowly been adjusting to the internet system, and that disrupted a lot of established business models. And I think it has led to direct access with your readers through Twitter or whatever. So individuals are getting empowered in some way. So the days of, like, when I started, I was at Reuters, and, we didn't have bylines that were a big new novelty at Reuters when I was there. They just come in. Like, for a long time, there were no bylines. And there were columns in many newspapers that were, effectively byline less, from Lex to Buttonwood in The Economist, whatever. There are less of those these days. There isn't a sort of house. I mean, editorial pages still have a house view, but the names are now front and center. So everyone is, the skin in the game that a reporter has is related to their reputation, and that, I think, has changed the nature of a lot of writing. But it's also confused the whole system, because when you were operating under a house voice, you had to comply with the masthead values of that publication. Whereas now, I think the individual, like the BBC obviously has had a really tricky time managing all these, heavily opinionated reporters, because they have a strict mandate towards neutrality, and journalists, trying to suppress journalists from having an opinion is really, really hard. So there's been a lot of disquiet in the BBC when, their Twitter policy was saying you can't have opinions and you have to be objective. It's, there is a real challenge, because journalists are people, and they are going to have opinions, and they can't be priests or Jedis that, completely sacrifice their personal life. I mean, they could do, but then there would be a far fewer amount of them. So my view is it's not, the problem isn't that journalists have opinions. It's when they are not transparent about their agendas. So it's fine to have if you're going to be an activist for X, Y, or Z, fine, work for an activist paper or a publication that makes it clear that this is where you stand and you're aligned with that mission. The worst thing in the market, as far as I'm concerned, are the platforms that say they are neutral, but they're actually full of people pushing an agenda. And that is where it's wrong. And it's incredibly, the other thing is when the masthead says X, and then the paper has been kind of like taken over by a completely different mindset, and then you're misselling really to your readers. So I really want to advocate alignment between journalistic views and opinions and the publications they write for. And if they write independently, that's fine, but it's tricky for the marketplace, because to do due diligence on every single piece you read. If it's part of a brand or a newspaper, you kind of get the idea. Oh, it's Fox News, it's right wing. The Guardian, it's left wing. But to do due diligence on increasingly like teeny tiny media establishments is really hard, which is why I'm advocating for a lot of the independents to group together under clear values like guilds, because I think that will help retain independence whilst disciplining the independents and making them be in their own right held to account, because you don't want to like shift out of mainstream media and then just create equally kind of crappy journalism on the independent side. So that's my view of things. I don't know if that really answered your question.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting, because even that point about sort of the independent, almost fragmented journalism that you're seeing on social media by people that are not trained to be journalists, but they come across like they're journalists, I think muddies a lot of the way that people think, muddies policy decisions, because it shapes popular opinions based on opinions that may not be based on any kind of facts. This is more just of a curiosity for me, but what are the skills that real classically trained journalists have compared to other people that claim that they are journalists that are just tweeting about something that they're observing locally? I mean, it's got to be more than just sort of a function of somebody trained for it versus somebody who didn't. It has to be something in terms of the way that one thinks about things.
So I think, first of all, jurisdiction really matters. And one of the problems with the internet is that there is no it's really hard. If everybody writes in English, you don't really know, what jurisdiction they hail from very easily. And the rules in the UK are very different to, say, America, where you have free speech protections to a different level than we do, right? We're very much bound by libel fears. There are really big consequences in the UK if you smear an oligarch, right? You will get probably lawfare to bits. If you misreport on a court case in the UK, there are real consequences. You could go to jail. So, and that's sort of the thing that amateurs don't really appreciate, at least in the UK. And you saw that with the famous case of Tommy Robinson, who was a kind of provocative commentator who claimed that the judge threw him in. He was found in contempt of court because he was basically breaking the court reporting rules on. There are all sorts of protections for people who are being tried, and in a bid to not influence the trial, right? And he was like, "Oh, I'm a journalist. I'm reporting on things," but actually, he was not doing that, because if he was a journalist, he would have known that there are restrictions to speech when you are reporting on trials in the UK, right? So those are the sort of basics that you get taught when you go to journalism school: legal, libel, risk, etc. In terms of how you operate or work a story, it's often a function of which newspaper you're working for. Every good newspaper will have a code of conduct or ethics and house opinion on sourcing, whether they accept anonymous sourcing or whether they don't, or how many how many different sources you need before you can go with it. So that's kind of variable, but overall there's good practice. And I guess one of the issues is that there isn't an international standard setter in this world. I think of it in market terms, and I think, why isn't there one? There should be some sort of international accounting standard type thing for journalists that is that can allow everybody to kind of conform with a specific criteria, which then allows the market to categorize you very nicely, like you would do some bonds, and then give you a rating for it, right? So that's what I would like to see in the journalism market, like some sort of self-regulatory mechanism that allows us to immediately know, well, this ex-journalist, she affiliates with this particular school of journalists, that means this is to be expected from her, etc., etc. And if she doesn't comply, she'll be ejected. She won't be able to carry that sort of stamp of approval, right? So that would be what I think can solve a lot of the problems that we're facing these days. But and then you can train people in different, in terms of, that's how amateurs can be filtered through the system. That's not to say there isn't a place for amateurs and citizen journalists. I think there is, actually. But I just think they need to be clear about where they're coming from. So as long as you're transparent, I think that's the key thing. And if you are not a professional, how else are you being funded? Who's funding you? What's your agenda? Because that's, at the end of the day, if journalists get paid to write, if you're an amateur, you're like your day job is trading stocks or working for X company, you can't necessarily trust that is a objective take, and not enough people are transparent about it.
How does financial journalism differ from other forms of journalism? And really where I'm going with that is, I think there's a cynicism around financial journalism in that you don't have the sort of real investigative type of work. I mean, I saw not too long ago the Madoff documentary on Netflix, and it's like, it seemed pretty obvious with hindsight, but a lot of journalists clearly were not able to kind of pinpoint that something was off in the investment return pattern from Madoff. Is there something that's fundamentally different about the way journalists cover markets versus cover other news?
No, I mean, in theory, we are, there are two types of journalism. There's reporting, and then there's sort of analysis and opinion, right? And or speculation, as you might call it. And the fundamental kind of reporting side of things is the same, I would say, everywhere. It helps if you know and understand the topic, because it helps, in terms of your ability to identify a good story or a scoop, or, because really it's about recognizing what the market wants. So if you have some financial expertise, you're probably going to be a better reporter. But the actual kind of process is similar. I mean, we are not in the, if you are reporting, you're not in the business of doing sort of due diligence or academic research level kind of, you know, testing of what you're putting forward. Like reporters report, the clue is in the name. So we have a hunch for a story or something's happened, and then we will talk to one person and then we will talk to another person, and we will kind of try to assess the credibility of the people we're talking to. And there will be different factors we consider in terms of who is a better source or voiced quote. And certainly we will always want to speak to people actually in the business rather than, say, observers or speculators. Like that's your ideal scenario, is going for people who are in the business, know what they're talking about. And then we package what they've told us and we kind of put it together with an angle, and we tell a story. That is what reporters do. And then on the other side, you have opinion and analysis. And that's kind of going into this, analysis moves into the sort of research side. So there's a bit of crossover there, and often like analysts and researchers think they can make good journalists because there is a bit of a crossover there. And that's a more analytical type of journalism. And opinion, obviously, is you're being paid to have an opinion, and you're good at it if you provide insight, which is, if you're commenting on financial markets, it's going to help if you have some financial experience or, economics, or certainly you're not going to listen to the opinion of someone who's never worked in or had much experience in markets, right? So I think that's important. And I think readers sometimes don't appreciate the difference between reporting or news reporting and the other type of journalism. And they're supposed to be quite segregated, although these days the two get merged as well. Although in my opinion, anything that has opinion, opinion columnists and writers can report on events, right? Because they're doing it as part of their opinion, and that you can communicate facts and news and scoops indirectly within the framing of an opinion piece. Like you can provide new information. But reporters, if your job is like being a reporter, you shouldn't really have an opinion. So if your product is branded as an opinion thing, like the blind spot is an insight and opinion-based thing, which can touch upon reporting, but it's not a pure reporting thing. That's the difference. But I mean, it's not, these days those old divides are kind of going away. And it's all a bit hodgepodge. So who knows? I mean, Semaphore has just launched with a model where they were doing reporting and then for like 2/3 of the story, and then at the bottom kind of giving their hot take on it, which is an interesting evolution of the segregation. Like the idea there was that they were going to make it clear what is opinion and what is reporting, right? But in my opinion, that also lands you in hot water, because in reality, it just turns the whole thing into opinion. Because once you put your opinion on it, you can't be neutral, right? So that's my take.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I am curious if in the financial journalism world, and we're going to talk about CBDCs and other things shortly, but in the financial journalism world, is there as much of a concern around getting access to key policymakers as non-financial journalism? So, if Powell is speaking, right, if Powell is speaking about something going on with the federal Fed, I have to assume that journalists are not going to necessarily want to push back on saying to Powell, well, why didn't you raise rates earlier? Right? They're always worried about also angering the person that they're interviewing. Talk about that dynamic for a bit, because I do think there's an interesting dynamic in terms of where we are today. If more journalists maybe countered what Powell or ECB was doing with all this money printing, maybe there would have been more of a public push before it was too late and before inflation got out of control.
Well, one of the reasons I think that, I mean, there are exceptions, so this is not entirely true, but most of the reporters who cover, press conferences are reporters. They're not going to be opinion people. The opinion people who have the capacity to sort of, really take the opposite view and push back are probably going to be at home. But that said, reporters, the duty of a reporter is to challenge and to kind of get the most out of whoever they're scrutinizing. So that's not to say they should have just taken everything for granted, right? So, and I think access journalism is a real problem across the board, not just in finance. You do worry about being frozen out of off the record briefings, because often what happens is that these big institutions, whether they're banks or whether they're, central banks or whether they're, whatever institution, they will summon, X amount of reporters to an off the record briefing, give them the stuff on embargo, and then control the messaging, because they know that like 20 reporters at the same time are going to write the same story. And because everyone is in the off the record briefing, you hear everyone else's questions. So you have no capacity to really differentiate yourself, because everyone's heard your idea in front of everybody else. So the message gets harmonized, and it creates this, like, once the embargo time goes, you'll notice, like, as a consumer of news, you'll be like, why is this story suddenly everywhere at the same time? It's because it's been managed in that way, and all those reporters come to the huddle or whatever because they can't afford to be frozen out of the process, because then they won't have access to the main people. And sometimes that is useful and good, because if it's a complicated topic, it's good to get an advanced reading of what it is and have it explained to you. I mean, it's not entirely crazy, but I do think it has a weird effect. And in politics, obviously, it happens even more so. So they have, and it happened in sports journalism. When I was at Reuters many years ago, I had to do some time on the sports desk. And I was quite shocked that when they sent me to cover some match, like there was, I think, Arsene Wenger or something giving a press conference, and there was a murder between all the, like a cartel between all the reporters, who basically then, after the briefing, come together and they're like, okay, so we'll save this bit that Arsene Wenger said, we'll save that for Saturday, and then on Sunday we'll go with the second thing. And they're doing it to like manage their own lives so that they have something for every day. And so it's kind of like it's gamed, and the incentive is not to, like, I mean, I don't know why more journalists don't just break those cartels and game theory and do it alone, but then they'd be, anyway, that happens a lot. So in finance, I think, how is it different in finance? I mean, it isn't really, and access is a big issue, and certainly I think in finance you get a lot of capture through the events side of things. There's lots of panels, and people go, or things like Davos, who gets to go to Davos, who funds your ticket, should you be reporting on it if a specific delegation has paid for you to be there, there's all sorts of like ways you can influence, I think, reporters, which is why transparency is really important. But then journalists don't get paid very much, so they're always inclined to top up their salaries with speaking engagements at banks or whatever.
Right, which muddies all the incentives. I am also interested in hearing your thoughts on how technology, artificial intelligence, has maybe changed journalism, in the sense of, I'm sure we're heading towards a period where there are going to be some news stories that are entirely algorithmically driven. I mean, it's already happening, right? With some articles, it's not a journalist; it's literally a Chat GPT type of algorithm. Do you worry about that? Does that concern you from a, not just sort of a career perspective, but just from a societal perspective?
So I do think it's interesting what's happening with all this AI. There's some obvious automation that's been going on for a long time in terms of like earnings reports and very formulaic writing that has been automated for a very long time. ChatGPT, I mean, I personally, having messed about with it, I don't think it's necessarily going to upend a journalist's job, because it's limited by what's on the internet, and it can't get access to people. It can't sit down and get somebody drunk and get them to tell you everything. That it's, and then when I have messed about with it, I've found that it has often been very inaccurate. So it's a very convincing liar, is what I've said. But when you dig deep into what it's saying, you realize there are massive errors, or it's assumed this or that. So if you're copy editing ChatGPT, like, you have to cross check every single fact, because it's actually really bad at fact. It does a very good job of kind of fooling you into thinking that it's authoritative. So it's like a great bullshitter and a con man, is what I would say. And I'm not sure that's ever going to change, because the only way it can change is if it learns the consequences of bullshitting. And I don't think AI has, I mean, maybe one day it might have some sort of existential fear injected into it because, it said something and it's got it in trouble. But I think we as humans, like any parent, will know that the intelligence of your children is very closely correlated to consequences of bad action. So if they do X or Y and it's wrong, there is usually some sort of consequence, whether it's in the physical world, they get hurt, or in the emotional world, or they get punished or whatever. I don't really see how ChatGPT can evolve in that way unless it gets embodied in some, I don't know. I'm speculating here. What do you think?
I think the whole thing is very disturbing, personally. I get that it can't be changed, but it's kind of like at a more extreme level, it's like who's watching the watchers. I mean, whatever the output is of AI is based on the input, and then who's controlling the input. And I do think that I do think there's a psychological element to this, which is that in general, when you read something and it's in your voice, it seems more believable as opposed to if somebody's saying it to you. Right, because there's almost a little sort of confirmation bias in your brain is tricking yourself. If you're reading something, it's like, you're the one reading it, so it must be accurate. So that's what kind of more concerns me from a societal perspective, more of a side note. Let me reset the room for the remaining minutes here. Everybody, please make sure you follow Izabella Kaminska. We're going to talk more about her venture with the blind spot. If any of you want to come up and ask questions, click that bottom left mic request button. And as always, this will be a podcast on all your favorite platforms. Let's go to the question.
The kind of, I guess what you're trying to say, I mean, Manufacturing Consent is a great book. One of we studied it at journalism school. It's something I suspect is probably not studied anymore. But I think the key point there that Chomsky has always made is that when you're trying to manufacture consent, you only need to really focus on that really small demographic of sort of middle class intellectuals, right? They tip the balance, because you're not going to change the opinions of the vast majority of people. So you're just aiming for that small middle ground. And if you can, so they're the objective of all the propaganda campaigns, whether it's from marketing agencies, whoever, right? So, and they can swing elections, they can, create companies, they, like, in terms of popularity, right? So if you capture their consent, that's what matters, right? And I think ChatGPT, there are many, I mean, what I'm trying to say is there are many different ways you can achieve that. And in the conventional sense, that was like the ownership of the main tabloids or the main broadsheets and influencing them directly through what they read. But in the older days, like you had the penny press, and this is more analogous to what's going on now, which was you influenced through sheer volume of and repetition of the same message. And it had a kind of gaslighting effect on society, because it was just coming at you from so many different sources. And I think ChatGPT has that sort of potential to kind of disrupt the current medium equilibrium through effectively a kind of DDoS attack on the system, because there's going to be just so many. If you want to sell a message, you can just get millions of ChatGPT trolls to kind of push your agenda, right? So that is the interesting challenge. Is it like a new form of mass pamphleteering? Is that what it might amount to? But then I think, I mean, I'm speculating here, but that's why linking things to real people is going to be incredibly important in the future, because you will never be sure if some avatar online is the real deal. And so anything that presents we're going to be incredibly suspicious of journalists without any obvious kind of track record in the real world, right? And there have been cases already where publications have been duped into publishing stories by journalists that don't even exist. I think there were a couple of cases where, someone had manufactured a journalist and sent the story freelance, and then even cultivated like a totally fake profile, like from scratch. So this person had like a LinkedIn. They don't exist. They're just like a front. You think of like espionage, you don't need spies anymore. You just need like very convincing avatars that can do the work for you. It's incredibly sinister in that sense. So yeah, if journalists are going to have to show their humanity, they're going to have to show there's going to be a proof of humanity somehow. I mean, we see that already with all the captures that we have to do when we enter websites, right? But those are going to get incredibly difficult. And I just don't, I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
I think you used a word that I want to focus on, which is sinister, because I think that's a good transition to CBDCs.
Okay.
Because I know you've talked about CBDCs before, and you're a fan of Bitcoin. First of all, I'm just curious, just again from a journalistic perspective, what made you interested in Bitcoin, and what are some of the concerns you have around CBDCs, which everyone has a conspiracy hat on as far as central bank digital currencies? There's some truth, I think, to the conspiracies, but let's go with that for a bit.
So I first started covering Bitcoin, I think circa 2012, or maybe 2012, I think. And Tracy Alloway, who's now at Bloomberg, was actually the first person at the FT to have done anything on Bitcoin, and maybe did it in 2011. So we were very early to it. And, I was incredibly skeptical of Bitcoin in the early days. And I think I stand by all my criticisms. I think the market has evolved very much how I predicted it would do, in that it wasn't scarce. There'd be lots of competition. There would be chaos, and then, stable coins, all that stuff. I was the first person at the FT to write about Tether and the implications for Eurodollar markets that would have, and the rise of stable coins effectively as new money market fund type products. So that, I think, I can't remember now, maybe 2017 was when I first wrote about Tether, which sounds like not that long ago, but it like at the, things have moved really quickly with stable coins, weirdly enough. Or maybe it was a bit earlier, I can't remember now. Anyway, so it was in that context, I think, that I witnessed the whole evolution of CBDCs. And I think in the early days, there was this mentality of, well, crypto is rubbish, but blockchain, the technology is brilliant. Can achieve these amazing things. And I was very skeptical of that. Because I detected a sort of like, most of the people saying that had no coding ability. They were clearly kind of just getting on a bandwagon. It was a type of virtue signaling or FOMO. Like, people were just saying it because it was the thing. It was the buzzword that made them look clever in meetings. Like, that was, and most of the people I interviewed at that time, who are often like C-suite people, when you really picked apart, like, do you know what you're talking about? It became obvious they didn't know the mechanics of it. So we were all kind of like the blind leading the blind. And in that context, CBDCs arose from what I would say is like a few speculative pieces by some academics, like, what if we'd have a Fed coin? Maybe that would be better. And it really captured the imagination of a number of people in central banking. But it wasn't until Libra, I would say, came along. Remember Facebook's attempt to corner the stablecoin market, right? That central bankers really took notice. And at the same time, roughly the same time, the People's Bank of China started sort of like playing around with the idea of digital currencies. So there are two analogous two parallel things going on. So Libra is happening up from the private sector. That's beginning to threaten central banks, and they begin to really think, hey, we could lose control of the monetary system if these private sector giants begin to do these things. And on the other side, you've got China pushing back against financial and trying to regulate. So you had this massive shadow banking system in China. A lot of it was based around WeChat and financial and these money market funds, effectively. that were, digitizing the economy there, and people joined in China. But it was incredibly popular, I think, because it was an evolution. But they did it because they were private companies still at the time, right? And then I think the pushback started, and you saw the crowding out of you started seeing the sidelining of Jack Ma, and that was when the PBOC announced that they'd be effectively taking control of these payments technologies. And they did what they did is that they then said, right, you can be payments companies, but if you're going to hold float as a payment company, you have to do it on a full reserve basis, and we'll offer you part of our balance sheet to do that. And so suddenly all the arbitrage and opportunity to rehypothecate all that float and money fell away. And I think it put pressure on those models a little bit, because under a full reserve system, which is effectively what they wanted to do, you'd have to, it was just going to be far more challenging than what it used to be. And that's why I think Jack Ma pushed back. I'm speculating here, but I think that was part of the whole debacle. So that's going on in China, and the Western central banks are going, hey, but this is quite cool. Look, they've managed to control the shadow banking sector. If we could only do that ourselves. So suddenly you get all these papers coming out from Western central bankers saying, yeah, we should start proof of concepts, and maybe we can do something here. We need a challenger. And then you had the kind of doctrine that if we don't do it, someone else will do it, stable coins will come in, and people won't have access to, digital money, because these are walled gardens, and we need a public good alternative, because it's our duty. As the world digitizes, we have a duty as public institutions to provide a digital equivalent of cash. And what if, God forbid it, cash demand just falls off the cliff, then there'll be all these financially excluded people. And that is the narrative that has brought us to where we are now. And I think the vast majority of the central bankers are operating in they are operating in good faith. They genuinely think that they have a duty to bring cash, a digital version of cash, to the markets, because the banking sector can't be relied on to offer everybody access to bank accounts, right? That is the rationale. But I'm very skeptical of that. I think there are many externalities. They're absolutely rejigging the structure of how monetary systems are organized. They're moving down the road of replicating what China's doing. And that has a bearing on the cost of deposits. It potentially starves the private sector of cash. And they say, oh, well, we don't want to crowd out the banks. And actually, we see a sort of hybrid solution where the banks can provide the wallets and all that sort of stuff. But the banks are likely to, I don't see what incentive the banks have in offering consumer goods focused around CBDCs unless they are going to be mining data. That's the only way I can see it making sense for them. So the central banks are saying, oh, don't worry, these things will be private and we won't program them, but you'll have the option to program it if you want, because programmable money is the future and it allows for innovation. But we know from how technology markets have evolved and data, in my opinion, just because you have the option to engage in a sort of programmatic transaction doesn't mean you're empowered, because in many scenarios in the internet economy, it's not really an option. You can't afford not to opt out. So I have to opt into all of Apple's terms and conditions, because if I don't, where do I go, right? I'm frozen out of the market, and there are only really two viable alternatives. Yes, they exist, but it's not really a viable option. And I worry that that's exactly what will happen. So you won't have, yes, it won't in theory be the central bank providing, if this then that conditionality on your money, but it will be the private sector. And this is a massive role reversal for banks anyway, because banks for the longest time have always been secret keepers. That has been their primary role in society, is operating. In fact, there's a great paper about their role as secret keepers, who's by someone who, I can't remember now who it was, by a very famous monetary economist. Anyway, the point being that they stop being secret keepers, and in creating programmable money, we end the fungibility of money itself. That is my biggest concern, because money is no longer, my dollar is no longer equivalent to your dollar, because it's the data trail that's attached to the money that determines the rate that it clears at for different goods. So my historical data record will, if I'm overweight, it might not allow me to buy chocolate at the same cost as it might allow a thin person. I mean, there's all sorts of like horrific dystopian scenarios that emerge in my head. But so yeah, and the other thing is there's no consultation. So there's, the UK is now doing a consultation, but nobody's really engaged on the public level. Like there is a consultation going on in a very sort of esoteric and cliquey part of the market. It's not like a public thing. Like if you go down the streets in London, nobody knows the Bank of England is doing a consultation. And so that also makes it feel very undemocratic. And I think for something as big as this, you really need a democratic mandate to go ahead with it.
Right, but presumably they're not bringing it to the public discourse because they know the public would be against it. I mean, I've got to assume that with depending on whatever metrics you're looking at, there's a correlation between trust and even wanting to consider CBDCs. In other words, if you don't trust the government, why the hell would you trust CBDCs to begin with? So it seems like it's almost a non-starter to try to have it as part of the public discourse.
Yeah, maybe, and certainly, they are trying. I mean, the European central bankers have made great efforts now in the last few weeks to try and find a better way to promote the virtues of a CBDC. So they have started to think about the PR side of it, and the sort of messages you're hearing are, we won't be the ones programming it, and yes, it's not entirely anonymous, but it is private, and no more sort of privacy constraining than normal money, where banks have to abide by KYC and AML. And then the other thing that they're saying is to try and sort of innovation and inclusivity, and the newest one that I thought was quite interesting was that we need a digital anchor, like a digital pound to anchor the private sector monies of the monetary system, because without one, you run the risk that the par value of that money detaches. It becomes completely fragmented, and there isn't a monetary anchor. But they base that on the idea that cash, the lack of ability to draw cash out of an ATM is going to somehow upset the kind of link between commercial money and public money. And that's true to a certain degree, except where they are at least in the UK, where they are misselling that story, is that actual cash in circulation is still going up. So despite all the digitization of the economy and of finance, actual cash in circulation, like physical banknotes, are going up still. So there hasn't been this massive, yes, they're circulating less. Maybe people are not using them for transactions in the lit markets. Maybe it's more for shadow exchange. Maybe it's for savings and people are using them. I mean, but it's definitely going up.
Do you think that the CBDC approach is going to be, is that inevitable? Is that fate? I mean, is there a chance that we don't adopt CBDCs, that Bitcoin does become sort of the standard? I'm curious to hear if you think this is just a lot of nonsense concerns over something that will never happen, or if it's a legitimate threat to the way the system operates.
No, I think they're going to do it. I think they're going to do it because they think if they don't do it, we will lose out to China or other authoritarian states. because they will get such efficiency from being able to manage the economy through data sharing effectively. So, the way I see it is that in traditional economic sense, the economy clears through pricing. Like prices adjust to get the balance of demand and supply to match, right? So, but in a CBDC world, it's data that's going to be clearing that. So you won't need that middle ground of a neutral money that adjusts in quantity or price to clear supply and demand. Instead, it'll be data and limitations on your access to X or Y. So if you've earned enough brownie points to get some bananas because say you're fat and you've lost weight and now you can have, like I see it in an Amazon sense, like suppliers and consumers are going to be matched against their projected demand and desire for certain goods. And that will be squared against whatever supply there is. And if there's a surplus of bananas, they'll create marketing campaigns to persuade you to not eat as many bananas, or they'll give you kickbacks for holding back on banana use this week, right? And if there's a deficit of bananas, but if there's a surplus of bananas, they'll try to find new markets that weren't around or discount heavily. So everything's going to be more like voucher discount. There won't be the conventional clearinghouse of centered on any sort of numeraire, right? And that creates the nearest thing we've had to that is Gosplan, like the planned economy under the USSR, which also had a really crazy approach to money because it actually had four different types of the ruble. Some had different restrictions on what they could and could be used. Like some could be only used in export markets. Then there was a pure accounting ruble, and then there was the ruble that you got paid wages in, and they all had different earning potential. But it was obviously 50 years ago, 60 years ago, so you didn't have the technological capacity. And there's a lot of people who think, oh well, Gosplan only failed because we didn't have the technology to manage these things, these signals from the market as cleverly. But now with AI and with computers, we can do away with money because from what's the phrase? From each to the want to the I always mess it up. So if you want X, you'll get it, and the market will adjust and find a way to we'll all be part of an exchange, the same way that stocks clear on an exchange, but without the price signal. Weirdly enough, because it will be entirely to do with different approaches to managing quantities. So that's how I think it's probably going to go. And the point they're making is if they don't do it, they won't be able to compete with China because China will do it. And an economy that fails to organize itself in that way is not going to be meeting its maximum potential. And so you will never be able to kind of, win a potential war with China because they will be more efficient at rationing themselves when they need to ration themselves. And, if you don't have that kind of total control of the population, you will lose out. That's what I think is motivating it. I don't have any evidence or proof other than continuing anxiety about China, but that's what I think is the FOMO behind it. And so in democracies, this is really hard because democracies are kind of crazy and disorganized and people do what they want, but that's really inefficient. So if you can just get a way to get everybody to operate in sync via a central command system that can, turn this knob on and get these people to do that, and then it seems really attractive and efficient. But I think that's actually not going to be long-term productive, because the great thing about democracies is that we have the capacity to innovate in ways that authoritarian regimes just can't. So the more you turn us into this kind of cog in the system, the less likely we are to come up with the really groundbreaking ideas that can elevate society and really move it forward in positive some ways, not just in regressive or potentially destructive ways. But I've been waffling now for a bit.
No. Well, I think for me, the real takeaway is to always pay for chocolate in cash. I think it's sort of the way to think about it from a go forward perspective. Anyway, listen, everybody here, please make sure you follow Izabella Kaminska. This is a great conversation. This will be a podcast on all your favorite platforms. Thank you, Izabella. Appreciate it.